right, so are you ready for this? Today we're doing a deep dive into the Anarchist Cookbook. You've probably heard of it, right?
Oh, yeah. It's definitely one of those things that gets people talking.
Yeah, for sure. And you actually shared some scanned pages from it, what looks like volume one.
Yeah, yeah, volume one.
And just like flipping through it, it feels like, wow, this is a time capsule. We're talking explosives, drug recipes, phone freaking. There's even like hand-to-hand combat tips in here.
Yeah. It's a wild mix.
That's a lot.
And I think that's kind of what makes it so fascinating, as a piece to kind of deep dive into, right? Not that we're endorsing any of this, but like what made this book so infamous?
Right.
And what does it tell us about, the time it came from?
Totally. And speaking of wild, I have to ask about this tennis ball bomb. It reads like something like a teenager came up with in their backyard, match heads and a tennis ball. Like, really?
Well, that's the thing about the Anarchist Cookbook is that it walks this line between like semi-technical instructions and frankly stuff that sounds like it's straight out of like a bad action movie,
That's totally. And that's where like my skepticism kicks in, right?
Yeah.
Was anyone actually detonating tennis balls with this book, or was it more about capturing this like rebellious spirit, even if just in theory?
Right. It's a good question. And, I think it's something that as we go through this, it'll be interesting to kind of keep in mind because the book does have this strained attention to detail in some parts.
Yeah.
Where it's almost like the author, genuinely believed in these methods. Like, for example, check out this Hindenburg bomb. Who knew you could make a DIY explosive allegedly with liquid plumber and aluminum foil?
Okay, that's both terrifying and impressive at the same time.
Right.
But it's interesting you say that about the details because some of the chemical formulas in here are surprisingly complex.
Yeah.
I mean, there's a whole section on making nitric acid, and it's not just some, vague idea. It's like actual formulas.
Yeah, and that's where things I think get really interesting from like I don't know, almost like a sociological standpoint, right? It's like, could someone, even with zero chemistry experience, could they actually use these instructions to like whip up dangerous substances in their kitchen?
Because let's be real,
Mm-hmm.
mixing up like household chemicals based on a book from who knows when does not exactly scream safety first to me.
Right. No, definitely not. And, the book does throw around the names of some seriously dangerous stuff like mercury fulminate. So I think while some of the formulas might be, technically accurate, the real danger, obviously, lies in someone trying to recreate these without the proper, knowledge and safety precautions.
Which, let me be clear, listener, we are not recommending anyone
Please do not try this at home. Yeah.
For real, for real. But it does make you wonder, like, who was this book's intended audience? Were they expecting, like, trained chemists to be flipping through this thing?
Right, and I don't think so. And I think that's where it's important to understand, again, the historical context of when this came out, right?
Yeah.
This was published in 1971, so a time of, like, immense social and political upheaval, right? I mean, the Vietnam War is raging, the civil rights movement is gaining momentum, and there's just this growing sense of, I think, distrust towards authority, particularly among like young people.
Right.
So the Anarchist Cookbook, I think, at least in part, becomes kind of a reflection of that era, the
Sure.
sort of DIY guide to rebellion, for better or for worse.
Yeah, absolutely. And speaking of reflections, there's a whole section on phone freaking in here, which I find so fascinating. Remember those like blue boxes that everybody talks about?
Yeah.
This book apparently tells you how to make them.
It does, and in surprising detail. I mean, it gets into like the nitty-gritty of like, tones, frequency, even like the specific phrases to use when you're like trying to manipulate phone systems. And you have to remember, this is way before the internet as we know it today. This is when like phone lines were the information superhighway.
Right.
So like hacking into those systems, even if it sounds kind of quaint now, was like a way to tap into this whole world of information that most people couldn't access.
And there's that great anecdote in here, too, about the blind phone freaks who would use electric organs to generate the specific tones they needed, which I just thought was so cool.
Yeah, that is such a good detail. That always gets me. It just speaks to, I don't know, a level of ingenuity and like determination that's pretty mind-blowing. No sight, just sound, and they were able to crack the code, so to speak.
It makes you wonder how those skills would translate into today's digital world.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. It really challenges your assumptions about like who can be a hacker and what tools they use.
For sure.
So we've got explosives, we've got phone freaking. What else is in store for us in this deep dive?
Well, you mentioned it earlier, but the hand-to-hand combat section is one for the books. And then perhaps even more intriguing, there's a whole section on like legal rights, lockpicking, even shoplifting. Okay, so it's not just about like, bombs and anarchy, it's suggesting a much more like nuanced mindset, right? One that's distrustful of authority, that's resourceful, maybe even a little bit paranoid.
Exactly, exactly. It's like a glimpse into like a survivalist mentality, like someone preparing for a world where they're going to need to rely on their own skills and their own knowledge to like navigate a system that they see as inherently flawed.
So it's not just about chaos then, it's about control.
Yeah.
Control over information, control over systems, control over their own destiny, even if that means operating outside the lines that society has, drawn for them.
And that, I think, is a theme we're going to see continue to play out as we kind of go deeper into the Anarchist Cookbook and really try to unpack not just the how-to, but the why behind this, controversial piece of history. It's easy to get, I think, caught up in the more like sensational elements of a document like the Anarchist Cookbook, especially in our world of like instant information and,
Oh, totally.
where shocking headlines often overshadow nuance.
Yeah, for sure. Feels like every day there's a new article with a headline like The Anarchist Cookbook, Blueprint for Disaster or something.
Right, exactly.
Super dramatic.
Yeah, and while it's, obviously crucial to acknowledge the potential dangers associated with the information that's presented, I think, what we're doing here with this deep dive allows us to kind of engage with this material on a more critical level, to go beyond the hype and try to understand the why behind the how-to, so to speak.
I like that. So how about we shift gears a little bit from the theoretical to the practical for a second?
Yeah.
We've talked about these chemical formulas, but you mentioned even if some of them are accurate, actually trying to recreate them at home is incredibly risky.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. And that's probably putting it mildly. The book occasionally mentions substituting household items for certain chemicals, like, using vinegar in place of acetic acid, that kind of thing.
So, like, hypothetically, someone could be reading this thinking, oh, I can totally whip up some explosives with, like, stuff I have under my sink.
It's a terrifying thought, isn't it? But it speaks to the danger, I think, of presenting technical information, without the necessary context and warnings, even if the formulas themselves are accurate, right? Like working with these chemicals without proper training, equipment, safety protocols, it's just a recipe for disaster.
Totally. So again, that question of who is the intended audience here? Were they expecting trained chemists to be flipping through this?
Right. And it's unlikely, which is why I think understanding the historical context is so crucial, right? This book was published in 1971. So like I was saying earlier, a time of immense social and political upheaval.
Right.
Vietnam War is raging. The civil rights movement is gaining momentum. And there's this, I think, growing sense of distrust, towards authority figures, particularly among like young people.
So the Anarchist Cookbook becomes like, at least in part, a reflection of that era. In a way.
Exactly.
A DIY guide to rebellion, for better or for worse.
Precisely. Yeah, it's like a manifestation of all those anxieties, frustrations, and also like the desires for change that were kind of permeating that period.
Right.
And so, while some might view it as this kind of like dangerous relic of a bygone era, others might argue that it speaks to a more, I don't know, like a timeless human desire for autonomy, for self-reliance, for, challenging systems that are perceived as unjust.
Which goes back to that whole, like, survivalist mindset that we were talking about earlier.
Exactly.
It's not just about chaos and destruction, but about equipping yourself with, like, the knowledge and the skills to navigate a world that feels like it's kind of on the brink.
It's interesting, though, because I think even within anarchist circles, the Anarchist Cookbook has always been, like, a point of contention.
Oh, really? Why is that?
Well, because I think, some would argue that it reinforces negative stereotypes about anarchism being solely about, like, violence and destruction, rather than, what they would say are its core tenets, like mutual aid, cooperation, dismantling oppressive hierarchies, that kind of thing.
Yeah, I can see how some of the content in here, if it's taken out of context, could definitely, like, feed that misinterpretation.
Exactly. Exactly. But that's why I think it's so crucial to remember that anarchism as like a philosophy is a complex thing. It has a rich history, a diverse range of interpretations. And the Anarchist Cookbook, in all its, contradictions and whatnot, represents just one sliver of that spectrum.
So how do we, like, reconcile that? That idea of this, like, more nuanced, community-oriented anarchism with a document that, at least on the surface, seems to be emphasizing self-reliance and, in some cases, even violence.
Right. And that's a question I think that each reader has to grapple with individually, But I think it highlights the importance of engaging with this material critically, understanding its historical context, and recognizing that it's not, this monolithic blueprint for like revolution,
Right.
but it's a product of a very specific time and place.
It's more about understanding the why behind the how-to, like you were saying.
Exactly, exactly. And perhaps, maybe it's also a cautionary tale about the importance of knowledge and responsibility and critical thinking.
Right.
Because information, even when it's presented with seemingly good intentions, can be misused, misinterpreted.
Totally.
Mm.
It reminds me of that old saying, like, a little knowledge is a dangerous thing, or whatever.
Exactly, exactly. And in the wrong hands or without the proper context, that little knowledge can have, unintended and potentially harmful consequences. Which, perhaps ironically brings us back to like the phone freaking section.
Oh, interesting.
Because even something as seemingly, harmless as like messing with phone systems back in the day, you could argue that that was a form of like, digital mischief.
Right,
Like,
right.
that could have had potentially serious consequences.
Totally.
And it also illustrates how technology, even in its earlier forms, has always been kind of this like, double-edged sword.
Right.
It can be used for liberation, for accessing information, for connecting with others.
But also for, like, exploitation, disruption, harm.
Precisely, precisely. And I think that duality is something that, we're still grappling with today on a much larger scale in our hyper-connected digital landscape.
It's like the anarchist cookbook, kind of.
Yeah.
Like, foreshadowed some of the challenges that we're facing right now with, like, misinformation, cybersecurity, the unintended consequences of, information being so readily available.
100%, yeah. It's a fascinating and somewhat unsettling parallel. And speaking of unsettling, I think it's time we address the elephant in the room, which is that section on, like, hand-to-hand combat, particularly that part about, like, how to kill someone with your bare hands.
Yeah, that's definitely the part that makes me the most uncomfortable, to be honest.
Right.
It's just a stark reminder that this isn't just like a harmless collection of, like, pranks and experiments. This document contains information that could be used to inflict real harm.
And I think it's important to, like, acknowledge that aspect and not shy away from it,
Right.
I think that's part of the book's legacy, for better or for worse.
It's interesting, though, how even in those sections, the tone is almost like clinical, detached, like you're reading an anatomy textbook or something.
True.
It's not like a glorification of violence, really.
It's true. And that, again, speaks to that complex and often contradictory nature of the book as a whole, right? It's this blend of, like, technical know-how, rebellious spirit, and then this strange, almost like naive belief in the power of information itself.
Which I think circles back to that whole thing we were saying about knowledge being a double-edged sword. It's not just about what you know, it's about how you use it.
100%. And that's a lesson that transcends any particular book or historical period. It's a timeless truth that we're constantly reminded of, I think, especially in this age of, like, information overload and digital echo chambers.
With all this talk about explosives and hacking and everything, there's this one little detail in the anarchist cookbook that really stuck with me.
Oh, yeah. What's that?
It's at the very end of the excerpt you shared. It just says, Kilroy was here.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's funny how these little details can just kind of jump out at you,
Totally. It's like this wink from the author,
Yeah.
Like, even amidst all this talk about, like, revolution and rebellion, there's this element of playfulness, of, like, individuality.
Right, like we don't take ourselves that seriously.
Exactly. And it makes you wonder about the intended audience for this book even more.
Right.
Was it really meant to be like a stone cold, serious, like, manifesto for overthrowing the government?
Yeah.
Or was there, like, a more nuanced message being conveyed?
Yeah, and it makes you think, like, was this a blueprint for action, or was it more like a way to signal belonging, to share knowledge within a certain group? I don't know.
It's like a secret code almost.
Yeah, exactly.
And it's like that Kilroy was here
Mhm.
is like the key that unlocks a different way of reading this whole thing.
Oh.
It's like suddenly all these technical details and, like, the rebellious spirit, even those potentially dangerous instructions,
Yeah.
they take on a different meaning when you view them through this lens of, like, subcultural identity and, like, this shared knowledge within a specific group.
Yeah, it reminds us that information is never neutral.
Right.
It's always embedded in, like, a certain context, a network of relationships, and, a set of intentions that shape how it's created, how it's shared, how it's interpreted.
Which I think brings us back to that like fundamental question we've kind of been dancing around this whole time. What is the Anarchist Cookbook really about?
Right. It's tough to say because it's a document that really resists easy categorization.
For sure.
It's a product of its time, definitely, reflecting those anxieties and aspirations of, a generation grappling with massive social and political upheaval. But I think it also transcends that historical moment. You know what I mean? Like, it's still relevant
Right.
because it raises these timeless questions about knowledge, about power, about the responsibilities that come with both those things.
Totally. And, maybe even more importantly, it reminds us that information is never static.
Right.
It's constantly being reshaped, reinterpreted, reappropriated by individuals, by communities in ways that can be, as we've been saying, both empowering and dangerous.
Right. And I love how you pointed out that Kilroy was here at the end, because whether it was intentional or not, it serves as this powerful reminder that that process is ongoing.
Yeah.
It's like a testament to that, like human desire to leave our mark, to connect with others, to find meaning, even in the most unexpected places.
It's a legacy that continues to resonate today, even if, like, the specific tools and tactics outlined in the book have largely faded into obscurity.
Absolutely. At the end of the day, it's not about, the bombs or the blue boxes. It's about these underlying human impulses, right?
Totally.
The things that drive us to seek knowledge, to challenge authority, to forge our own path in this complex and ever-changing world that we live in.
Well said. So, as we start to wrap up this deep dive into the Anarchist Cookbook, what's like the one takeaway you hope our listeners are walking away with today?
I think the most important thing is to approach information, especially information that seems provocative or potentially dangerous, to approach it with a critical and discerning eye. Right.
To ask questions, consider different perspectives. Remember that there's always more to the story than meets the eye.
Love that. And maybe, just maybe, find a little bit of humor and humanity in those most unexpected places.
Exactly.
Even in a document like the Anarchist Cookbook.
100%, because ultimately it's our ability to engage with information thoughtfully, ethically, and with a sense of curiosity that will really determine how we navigate the challenges and the opportunities of this increasingly interconnected world that we're living in.
Couldn't have said it better myself. Thanks so much for joining me on this deep dive. And listener, remember, knowledge is power, but only when used wisely.